All right, strap yourselves in because we're going deep on this one. This is Richard Chase,
Oh.
the Vampire of Sacramento, a name I'm sure you've heard before, but this one is
Uh,
way more than just the headlines. We're using the Infographics Show as our guide, and we're
hmm
really going to dig into not only the crimes, but also kind of the why.
Mm.
Like what takes someone
Yeah. Yeah.
down that road. And the thing is, even though this was all the way back in the 70s, it's
Mhm.
still so relevant today, unfortunately. We're talking mental illness, the cracks in the system, all that stuff. So
Totally.
get ready. This is going to be a heavy one.
It really is one of those cases that, I mean, it sticks with you. It's like,
Yeah.
it's just a stark reminder of how fragile things are
Yeah.
and how sometimes the most monstrous acts are rooted in these deeply human tragedies.
Right. Exactly. It's not just a monster under the bed kind of story. There's
A whole lot more going on. So let's start with the beginning, with the discovery that kind of set this whole nightmare in motion. January 1978, Sacramento, California, we have Teresa Wallen, a young pregnant woman, found murdered in her own home. I can't even imagine what her husband went through coming home to that.
Oh, it's just unimaginable. This scene was absolutely horrific. Not only was she brutally murdered, but there were signs of mutilation, her organs, they were scattered around the room. And there were these really disturbing elements that pointed to something ritualistic. A yogurt container filled with blood. Blood smeared on the killer's face like he'd been licking it. It was just awful. And yeah, in the bathroom, there were signs that he had actually been like licking the blood from his fingers. Chilling stuff.
It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
It does. It does.
But this was real life. Thankfully, the FBI got involved, and they brought in Robert Ressler.
Ah, wrestler.
This guy was like a legend, one of the very first criminal profilers.
Oh, absolutely. He was a pioneer in the field. Getting inside the killer's head, understanding their motivations. It was all pretty new back then.
Yeah. But even so, I mean, from what I've read, his profile in this case was incredibly accurate.
No, it really was. I mean, he got the basics right, of course. He predicted a white male, late 20s, local to the area, probably kind of scruffy looking, thin,
Yeah.
the usual physical stuff. But
Yeah.
what's remarkable is that he also zeroed in on the psychological aspects. He said this was a disorganized killer, probably suffering from delusions, maybe even schizophrenia. And that
Yeah.
was huge because it shifted the focus from just catching a guy to understanding the mental state that could lead to those kinds of acts.
So it's not just about finding a bad guy, but about understanding the why,
Exactly.
the twisted thought process behind it all.
Yeah, the twisted long.
And that profile, it ultimately led them to Richard Chase. And when you look at his life, it's like a textbook case of missed opportunities, escalating mental illness. Oh, absolutely. His childhood was extremely troubled. He exhibited those classic warning signs. Bedwetting, cruelty to animals, even arson. The triad of sociopathy.
Yeah, I've heard of that. But I mean, this wasn't just some kid acting out, right?
No, not at all. As he got older, it escalated. He got into drugs, started to have these really disturbing paranoid delusions. He'd say things like his heart had stopped or that he was losing blood.
Which, knowing what we know now.
Right. Chilling. Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just talk. He started killing neighborhood pets, capturing them, drinking their blood. Some reports even say he was injecting it.
Oh, God.
People were noticing pets going missing, but nobody really connected the dots.
It's like everyone around him was just
Nice.
oblivious, like sleepwalking through a nightmare.
It's a classic example of how these things can escalate under the radar.
Huh?
And then there was that incident in Nevada. He was found wandering around naked, covered in blood.
Wait, what?
Yeah. He claimed it was cow blood, and they just let him go.
Are you serious? So nobody...
I know. It's mind-boggling.
Nobody saw the danger.
It's like they didn't grasp the severity of what was happening.
Wow. And to think, this is all before he even committed his first murder.
Right. It's terrifying to think about how easily he slipped through the cracks. And the saddest part is, his own mother played a role in this too.
Really? How so?
Well, Chase was clearly exhibiting symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. He believed his body was deteriorating, became obsessed with human organs, thought he needed blood to survive.
Oh, God.
He was actually hospitalized several times for some really bizarre and dangerous behavior. Like he was caught blending animal organs into drinks. But
What?
yeah, it's disturbing stuff. But the system failed him. He was repeatedly released, despite the obvious risks.
And his mother.
She actually took him off his medication, thought he didn't need it anymore. It's heartbreaking. Whether it was denial, misplaced concern, whatever it was, it contributed to his downward spiral.
It's just so sad. A total failure of the system and a tragic misunderstanding of mental illness.
Exactly. A perfect storm of bad decisions and unfortunate circumstances. And sadly, Teresa Wallen paid the ultimate price.
It's hard to wrap your head around it all. On one hand, you have this deeply disturbed individual with untreated schizophrenia, a history of violence, this growing obsession with blood. And on the other, you have a system that completely failed to protect the people who needed it most.
It really is.
It's overwhelming.
And that's what makes this case so important to discuss. Even today, we're still struggling with these same issues. How do we balance compassion for those with mental illness with the need to protect society? That's a tough question.
It is, and one that we'll definitely keep exploring as we go deeper into this case. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk more about Robert Ressler's profile. You mentioned that he got a few things wrong, but what was it about his approach that made him so effective? What set him apart from the typical police work of the time?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why this case is so significant. We'll definitely unpack all of that in the next part of our deep dive. So where we left off, you were asking about Ressler and what made him so different.
Yeah. Like, what was it about him that really made him such a pioneer in this whole profiling thing?
I think it was his willingness to go beyond the surface, to see a crime scene, not just as a collection of clues, but as a window into the mind of the offender. He understood that to catch a killer, you had to understand how they thought, what made them tick. And in Chase's case, that was crucial.
Okay, but how did that actually play out in the investigation? Give me an example.
Well, take the ritualistic aspects of the crime scenes, the blood drinking, the way the organs were scattered. Most investigators back then would have just dismissed that as the work of a crazy person,
Right.
Just random acts of violence. But Ressler, he saw something more.
He saw a pattern.
Exactly. He recognized that those actions weren't random, that they were driven by Chase's delusions.
Right.
Remember, Chase believed his body was deteriorating, that he needed blood to survive.
Right.
So Ressler connected those beliefs to the crime scene evidence, and that's what made his profile so incredibly accurate. He was able to get inside Chase's head.
Wow. So in a way, Ressler was almost like a...
Kind of, yeah. He had to think like Chase in order to catch him.
And that profile ultimately led to Chase's arrest, right?
It was a key piece of the puzzle. But... and this is where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Even with a mountain of evidence and a clear history of mental illness, the question of how to handle Chase legally was anything but straightforward. I mean, how do you punish someone who may not even fully understand their own actions?
Right. So what happened? Did they go with the insanity plea?
His lawyers definitely considered it. I mean, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his history of mental illness was undeniable. So their strategy was to argue that he was legally insane at the time of the murders.
Hoping to avoid the death penalty, I guess.
Exactly. They wanted him committed to a mental institution instead of prison. But the jury didn't buy it.
Wow. So even with all that...
I know, it's tough to hear. Despite his lawyer's best efforts, Chase was found guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death.
Death. In the gas chamber. Wow. That's a tough one. I mean, I understand the severity of his crimes, but still.
It's a complex issue. And it speaks to that ongoing debate about how we balance justice with the recognition that mental illness can really impact a person's actions. Where's the line? It's a tough question.
It really is. And it makes you think about the victims, too. Their families.
Absolutely.
All the people whose lives were shattered by these horrific acts.
It's not just about the perpetrator, is it? The ripple effects of these crimes are enormous. Entire communities are left traumatized, trying to make sense of something so senseless.
Right. It's like this darkness that just spreads outward, touching everyone it comes into contact with.
Exactly. But, amidst all this darkness, there's also something else, a kind of unintentional legacy that emerged from this case.
Okay, I'm listening.
You see, as horrific as Chase's crimes were, they actually helped to advance our understanding of criminal psychology. They forced us to confront the realities of mental illness in a way that we hadn't before.
So it's like these horrific acts, in a way, led to some positive changes.
It's strange how that works, isn't it? But yeah, by studying Chase, his motivations, the details of his crimes, Ressler and other researchers were able to refine their profiling techniques, which ultimately helped to solve other cases and maybe even prevent future tragedies.
Wow. It's hard to find a silver lining in something like this, but I guess sometimes even the darkest events can lead to some good.
Exactly. But there's another layer to this legacy that's equally important, and that's the impact on mental health awareness. Chase's case really put a spotlight on the failings of the system,
Mm.
the lack of resources, the stigma surrounding mental illness, the way people like Chase were essentially left to fend for themselves.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the missed opportunities, all the ways things could have been different.
It is, and it makes you wonder how many other Richard Chases are out there, struggling in silence, slipping through the cracks. It's a chilling thought.
So we've talked about the failings, the tragedies, the impact on criminal justice and mental health. But what about Chase himself? What ultimately happened to him?
That's another layer of tragedy to this already tragic story. While he was on death row, awaiting execution,
Yeah.
he actually died in prison, took his own life in 1980, overdosed on antidepressants that he'd been hoarding in his cell.
Wow. It's like he was haunted by his own demons right up until the very end. It's a fittingly dark ending to an incredibly dark story.
It is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on something else.
Yeah.
Why do you think this case continues to resonate with people today? What is it about Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, that keeps us coming back to this story?
That's a good question. I mean, it's definitely a disturbing case, but there's also something, I don't know, something about it that's just so fascinating.
I think it's because it taps into our deepest fears,
Yeah.
The idea that someone like Chase could just blend in,
Yeah.
could be living right next door and we'd never even suspect it. It's terrifying. But it's also a reminder that evil can take many forms.
And that even the most ordinary seeming person can be harboring darkness within.
Exactly. And I think that's why true crime in general is so popular. It allows us to explore these dark corners of human nature from a safe distance. It gives us a glimpse into the abyss without actually having to step into it.
Right, right. It's like a controlled dose of fear and fascination. But in this case,
Yeah,
it's not just about the horror, is it? It's about trying to understand what went wrong, how we can prevent something like this from happening again.
absolutely. And that's the real value of exploring cases like this. They challenge us to think critically about our justice system, about mental health care, about how we as a society treat the most vulnerable among us.
It's a reminder that we can't just turn away from the darkness.
No, we could.
We have to confront it head on if we ever want to make a real difference.
Well said. And that's why the legacy of Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, will continue to haunt us, to intrigue us, and to challenge us for years to come.
All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Richard Chase.
Yeah, it's been a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
It has. I mean, we've gone through the details of his crimes, his incredibly disturbed mental state, all the missed opportunities to maybe intervene, the impact on the victims, the community. It's just a lot to process.
It really is. And as we kind of shift to talking about his legacy, I think it's important to note that even in all this darkness, there were some glimmers of light, some positive things that came out of it.
Okay, now when you say glimmers of light, what do you mean? It's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of something this horrific.
Yeah, I get it. But hear me out. Chase's case, tragic as it was actually a major turning point for both criminal justice and mental health. It forced people to start taking these issues seriously, to see the connections, and to start making some real changes.
Okay, so you're saying that because of what happened, because of these awful crimes, things actually started to improve.
Exactly. Back in the 70s, deinstitutionalization was all the rage. The
Yeah.
idea was to move people out of these big, often inhumane institutions and into community-based care. Sounds good on paper, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, a lot of people with severe mental illnesses like Richard Chase, they just end up falling through the cracks. They weren't getting the treatment they needed, the support.
And the consequences were, as we saw with Chase, devastating.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And so his case became this tragic example of what can happen when the system fails, when people who are really struggling, who are a danger to themselves and others, are just left to fend for themselves.
Right. So it's like it took this horrible event to finally wake people up to the reality of the situation.
Exactly. People started asking tough questions. Were there enough safeguards? Were communities equipped to handle this? Could these kinds of tragedies be prevented?
And did anything actually change? I mean, did things actually get better?
Well, it's not a perfect system, not by a long shot. But things did start to shift. There was a real push for more comprehensive mental health care, more resources, more support for people in the community.
So we're talking about a real paradigm shift.
Yeah, it's not just about locking people away anymore. It's about providing real help, treatment, and support.
That's a huge change. And it sounds like Chase's case, as awful as it was, really played a role in that.
It did. And on the criminal justice side, as we've discussed, Robert Ressler's work on this case, his profiling, that was groundbreaking too. It helped to legitimize criminal profiling as a real tool for law enforcement.
Right, right. Ressler's approach was so different from what was being done at the time. He wasn't just looking at the physical evidence, he was trying to get inside the head of the killer.
Exactly. He saw the connections between the crime scene and the criminal psychology. He understood that to catch these guys, you had to understand their motivations, their thought processes.
And Chase's case, with all its bizarre elements, the ritualistic stuff, the clear signs of mental disturbance, that provided a lot of valuable insights.
Absolutely. Ressler didn't shy away from the darkness. He knew that to really combat evil, you had to understand it. And his work, informed by cases like this one, it changed how we investigate these kinds of crimes.
Wow. So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing to take away from the Richard Chase case? What do you hope people will think about after listening to all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that these cases are never simple. There's always more to the story. There's a human element, a whole web of factors that contribute to these horrific acts. We can't just look at the crime in isolation. We have to look at the context, the history, the systemic failures that allowed something like this to happen.
Right, right. It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. And while we can't undo the past, we can learn from it. We can use these tragedies as opportunities to make things better, to push for better mental health care, to challenge the stigma surrounding mental illness.
To work towards a world where these kinds of things are less likely to happen?
Exactly. It's about empathy, understanding, and a commitment to building a more just and compassionate society.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our exploration of Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. It's a story that will stay with you long after you hear it, a story that challenges us to confront some uncomfortable truths, but also to work towards a better future. We hope you found this deep dive informative and thought-provoking, and we'll see you next time for another journey into the depths of true crime.